All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and before we get going here with this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story, I wanted to say thank you guys so very much for putting up with no interviews last month. I've got some coming out here heading into December. Going to get back to doing some encounter interviews from individuals like yourself from around North America in general. And I wanted to say thank you for being here. As a matter of fact, just to let you guys know, this next month's giveaway, I've got some awesome artwork from a member here, and I'll be sharing that with you a little bit more next week. And also, of course, an awesome t-shirt from PacWest Bigfoot. Also, just want to let you guys know real quick, I do have a sponsor, kind of, I guess you could say, for PacWest Bigfoot now. I don't really take on sponsors or anything, but he's a good friend and he's got a great product, and it is Sasquatch Coffee. That's right. So I'll be kind of partnering up with Gunnar Monson there over at Sasquatch Coffee. Him and Shane Corson are also headed up over there at Monster X Radio. You guys can check them out. And this week I wanted to give a shout out to Bana. You got that awesome Bigfoot show going on, man. So you guys need to check that out. It's pretty cool. So with that, let's that's really it. Let's get in and let's get on to this week's counter story. I really liked this one when it came in. It was pretty interesting, pretty cool. So here we go. Bigfoot haunts old cabin in the woods outside Cascade, Idaho. It was me who took the dare, but it was myself and my best friend who decided to tempt a night in an old haunted cabin outside Cascade, Idaho, when we were teenagers. Here's what happened to us and how we come to know Bigfoot roam the state of Idaho. It was the scariest night of my life, his too. That includes my two tours of Afghanistan to boot. My best friend and I lasted longer than anyone else and lived to talk about it out there. Here's my story, and if you don't mind, keep my last name out of it. I like my privacy, and I'm still serving in the military, even at my age today, and prefer not to be bothered by all this. I just wanted to share with you all of what happened that night in memory of my best friend. It was a dare, a stupid dare. I have been in 4 firefights, literally downrange of machine guns and bullets whizzing around trying to find their mark, the middle of my chest, or yeah, my head. But the night my best friend and I came across a Bigfoot that wanted us gone or dead, well, that seemed scarier. This all happened in 1979, the fall I remember. It was late October, still a bit warm for that time of the year in Idaho, but not unexpected. My best friend and I were born and raised in Idaho. He also died there not 10 years later in a car accident upstate. While I headed off to a military career, he would end up getting into some trouble and mixing it up with some other bad behaviors that led to his death. However, I miss my friend, even today. And I will check in with his mom from time to time, who is now nearing the end of her life as well. I shared with her what happened that night a few years back, and she thought we were nuts, and said she would have spanked him had she known, even if he were around today. That thought makes me laugh even now. But what happened that night does not. Here's how it went down. The classic stand by me attitude. Yeah, we thought ourselves that fearless, even courageous. Back then, divorce was on the rise, but it was still not the epidemic it is today. My best friend and I were, however, raised by single moms. I guess that is what brought us together at first. We met when our mothers met in a group for divorcees, and we hung out that evening and practically every day after that. As we grew older, we were a little reckless, to tell you the truth, and sometimes ended up in some trouble with not just our own mothers, but the police a few times. It was never too serious, but mischief is mischief. By the time we were 15, though, things did calm down for us in the being too reckless department, as our mothers started taking us to church on a regular basis, and we both were part of the local Boy Scouts organization. But we were still brave, we believed, and when given the dare to not only visit the local haunted house or cabin, more like it, we were in. We took up that challenge. It was a couple of days after Halloween, I remember, when we decided to hang out with some friends at a local arcade to do some skateboarding in a parking lot that had some great terrain for us. It was during a short break in the mayhem of skating when myself, my buddy, and I think about 4 or 5 of our friends were sitting on the sidewalk when the conversation of the old haunted cabin came up. One of our friends, he was a pretty honest kid, by the way, but he started talking about his Halloween with his family a couple of nights before. Eventually, the conversation found its way to the cabin that I had seen twice up to that point in my life. I never hung out long enough because it was that way outside of town, and I was a kid when I did see it with my mother on a hike both times. It was an old rustic thing that still stood at the time. It even had glass still in the windows. Well, except for one busted out on the back side of the cabin, I remember. Anyways, he was talking about how it was home of an old trapper back in the day. His father had told him at one time or another. The story was pretty straightforward, thrilling I suppose, but I never believed it at first. The story goes that the old trapper had built the cabin not knowing that there was some monster that lurked out there during the fall and winter months. He built it in the spring, lived and trapped all summer, then that was it. One day he was found torn apart and half-eaten by a wild animal. Now the story goes also that he haunts the place during those particular times of year, warning people to leave, to not stay there, as the supposed monster of the woods would, in fact, eat them. I shrugged it off and blurted out some passive comment that caught the attention of all sitting there sucking down Slurpees. That was a mistake I made that I would never forget. That moment, and to make it part of my story here short, I dared to go out there, spend the night, and not be eaten alive. Personally, I was not scared of the dark. Seriously, some kids were afraid of the dark, but not me. I was one of the few who could basically care less about it. My best friend, though, well, he believed the story, and the last thing he wanted to see was me eaten alive by some creature of the woods, or freaked out about seeing a ghost. So not only did he say he would go with me, but we would both use the fact for the old "I'm going to sleep over at the friend's house and we're going elsewhere" trick with the parents. Well, it worked, of course. The weather was cold, but not cold enough to be worried about freezing at night. It would get cold up in the basically upper 40s, lower 50s. It's not bad at all, especially for that area, and during the first day or two of November. The cabin. I lived on the outskirts of town, the west side. Beyond me was a forested area for the most part, and the cabin itself was only a few miles back, at the most I remember. I had never heard anything around my house. I had never seen a single thing out of the ordinary until that night either. We would not even last a single night out there, just so that you know. Bigfoot was the last thing on my mind. I did not believe, I guess, or more like I never really thought about it, period. As I said, ghosts, Bigfoot, and whatever else you could throw at me was of no worry up to that point. I was not afraid of the dark or what some people might believe was in it. I didn't think they were there. Well, that was about to change. We told the parents the classic story of staying at the other's house so we could take off and head out on the dare. By the way, if I won, I could stay out there all night. I'd get my friend's new skateboard from a new company at the time called Pal Peralta. It was going to be a total steal, or at least I thought it would be. We took off early, actually about 3:30 in the afternoon, I recall. It took us all 25 minutes or more to trot, walk, and run a bit to the cabin. There it was, in the middle of a large clearing that was surrounded by trees. The old cabin was run down, one broken window like I said, but for the most part it was still livable, surprisingly enough. Inside was half of an old wood stove, one flatbed-like piece of furniture that was it. 4 walls, nothing more. It was dirty inside, but the front door still worked, so all that was in there was some raccoon droppings here and there, and a lot of dust and cobwebs. We tried to clean it up a bit, and my buddy lost the flip of a coin for the flatbed-like thing that was still sturdy enough to hold one of us. It was getting dark faster, being almost mid-fall by that point, or the end of it, and so we gathered some wood for a fire in the bottom half of this old stove. It's cool at first. It was cool at first, and I was daydreaming about that new board here and there for a bit. By the time dusk rolled around, however, things became a little, well, queer, even spooky. Crunch, crunch, crunch. We had a pan and a ton of ramen noodles to eat, plus a huge bag of candy from Halloween left over for afterward. We got the fire started and we were eating when I heard crunching, as in something walking in the forest. It was too dark to see anything. Even as it came closer and closer, it was walking fast as it approached until all of a sudden, when it seemed to be just beyond the trees, it stopped. I remember looking over at my buddy, and he said it was probably a bear or mountain lion, and realized we were here. I wish that were the case. Seconds later, we heard lighter footsteps, and that is what was weird about it all of a sudden. It sounded like footsteps. "Go home, buttheads!" I heard my friend yell out in the dark. Funny thing, we listened as the footsteps seemed to disappear after a few moments east of the cabin. He told me it was most likely our friends trying to scare us. That made sense all of a sudden, and my heart seemed to stop beating so hard as we headed back inside for the night. At the window. I do not remember what time it was exactly my buddy woke me up, but he did. He was accusing me of farting and stinking up the place to high heaven. As I came from a deep and surprisingly comfortable sleep, I smelled it too. Some have said it smells like rotten flesh and whatnot. Personally, it smelled like wet dog and garbage. But actually rotten flesh? Maybe. But it was overwhelming either way. We both held our arms over our noses for a few moments when I looked at my buddy and noticed just behind him through the window, movement. I freaking screamed. My buddy was as fast as lightning, moving from where he was at and diving towards me and looking back at the nastiest thing we'd ever seen up to that point in our lives. It was like a really scary monkey-like face with the nose of a human, however. Hairy, except around the eyes and forehead. Its eyes were dark, beady, and it had a look like it was, well, pardon my French, pissed off we were even there. The haunted stories of this place came flooding into my head, and I realized this place was haunted all right. Haunted by Bigfoot. My buddy started whispering what he knew this thing to be, a Bigfoot. However, as he whispered, I could tell he was freaking out as much as I was, and even near the point of peeing ourselves. You have no idea what it's like, the fear that is when you are standing in front of one of these monsters. It was looking at us, breathing heavily, and eventually, making matters worse for our fear at that point, it reached in through the broken window and made a swipe at us with its large, hairy, stinky arm. I swear that arm was long, really, really long. We were on the opposite side of the cabin, and that thing's arm nearly reached a halfway point. We were extremely frightened by then. Fee, fi, fo, fum. It was bent over, too. You could tell this thing's head was higher, a bit higher than the eave of the roof. Yes, it was a small cabin, one-roomer, but the roof was still at least, if I remember correctly, nearly 7 feet or so off the ground. It turned and started walking around the back side of the cabin, and before we knew it, it was already at the front door. My heart stopped as it seemed to either slap or punch it so hard it felt at first it was going to fall off. We were not sure what we were going to do except one thing: get the heck out of there. Quick thinking by my buddy, I swear, saved us. He dove through the window the second that thing started wailing on the front door, and I followed him. It was cold, the ground was damp or wet. Before I even looked back, the monster had crashed through the front door of the cabin. It did not enter it, but stood there screaming with such an awful sound. I froze in fear until my buddy grabbed me by the arm and pulled me off into the tree line. I did not look back, neither did he, I noticed, even when we heard the thing stomping through the forest behind us. For almost 2 miles of the nearly 3-mile leg back to my house, we heard that thing crashing through the undergrowth and tearing through limbs of trees as it closed in on us. Before the nightmare ended, we would, however, see this thing clearly, as it would give us a scare that had me literally wet myself a bit. We came to an opening in the trees, the only one we'd seen from that point on, until we reached the back of my property. Before we made it to the other side, we could feel this thing right behind us. It screamed so loud, I tripped and fell, scraping my knee real bad. My buddy gasped as he looked back, and there it stood, a giant of the forest, a scary, ugly, smelly monster of a creature screaming at us, as if it wanted to eat us or something. It was covered in dark hair. However, with what little light available, there seemed to be white streaks on its chest and shoulders. It screamed again, and that sent us into a panic mode, and we started running through the forest without care. We just wanted to be home, that was all. It did not follow us any further than that clearing. At least we did not hear it any more by the time we hit my property. Out of breath and in hot water. I think the scream must have woke my mother. As we entered the backyard, I saw her standing there with a frantic look on her face. She said she heard something scream several times. We were in hot water, though, the both of us. She took us inside, and we told her our story. My mom, well, she was a true comforter. She believed every word we said, and even mentioned an old story of her own about how she and her grandpa and grandmother had seen something like that cross the highway once up in northern Idaho. She calmed us down and let us stay up until we could no longer keep our eyes open. And to our relief, she never said a word to my buddy's mom either. It all was kept between us. Today my mom and I still share the story from time to time about that night and what she had seen as a little girl. It ended up being one of those nights you never forget, and one that helps you grow that mother and son relationship that lasts a lifetime and beyond. Well, that's my story, and we'll let you know if we ever see or hear anything again. Oh, and one other thing. Thanks, Tommy, for all the memories, bud. Thanks, Carl.